If you've watched any of my content, you'd already know I have a certain fascination with the death metal of the 1990s. To get particular, one year that stands out to me as the zenith of this progression is 1993. Death metal was initially conceived in the mid to late 80s as a genre hardly different from its proverbial parent genre, thrash metal. The lyrics were dark, the drums were lightning fast, the guitars aggressive and staccato. However, it was the little differences that truly clarified this delineation. Thrash metal's lyrics were dark, sure, but death metal reveled in the edgy, often violent atmosphere like no other genre. While, say, Metallica or Anthrax may have a song about a mass murder, it would remain fairly tasteful in lyrical execution. Okay, so maybe Slayer might have breached said territory first, but death metal as an entire genre made no bones about diving deep, often taking the lyrics into explicit detail, putting the listener directly into the eyes of the psychopathic and homicidal. Death metal was also more sonically aggressive. While some couldn't have expected the metal genre to get any more abrasive, death metal cranked it to 11. The yelling stylings of bands like Slayer or DRI might have been a great influence, but death metal vocalists took it one step further to full-on, no-holds-barred, make your throat feel like it's on fire, growling. This in some ways could be considered a rejection or backlash to thrash metal. To some, it was too tame, too polished, too fun. This can partially explain why so many of the early iconic death metal albums sound like dog shit. But for the most part, it was also an issue of budgetary restraint and the time it took to sonically perfect a brand new subgenre of metal. In its earliest shining moments, death metal was a lot like punk. It was comprised of young kids who said fuck you to the mainstream by releasing the most subversive music their angsty brains could conceive. But what about the kids that wanted to retain the brutality of death metal, but co-opt something more technically proficient? Atheist originally formed as Oblivion in 1984, 40 minutes away from the death metal haven of Tampa, Florida. They would soon change their name to Ravage in 1985. Ravage was actually an acronym standing for Raging Atheists Vowing a Gory End. Ravage's founding lineup consisted of Roger Patterson on bass, Steve Flynn on drums, and Kelly Schaefer on guitar and vocals. They released 3 demo tapes and were featured on one split EP. Their first demo effort, Rotting in Hell, released sometime in 1985, and it exhibited all of the common characteristics of early, standard death metal. With song titles like Kill or Be Killed and Brain Damage, you could imagine what you were in for. But if one listens closely, you'll notice there's a little bit more to Ravage than what is easy to assume from their aesthetic. From the onset, you'll find that the guitar work is a bit tighter than what the scene was putting out at the time, and the drumming by Steve Flynn was much less sloppy or plain than early death metal drummer standards, obviously stemming from Flynn's love of Rush and Neil Peart. By the time of their 2 demo releases in 1987, Ravage had begun to blossom into the technical death metal innovators that they were destined to become. Ravage would also recruit Rand Berkey on lead guitar, a key player for their future efforts. By 1988, Ravage would change their name to Atheist, releasing their demo Beyond, which would catch the attention of Mean Machine Records and feature songs that would later be released on their landmark 1989 debut, Piece of Time. Piece of Time would be released on Active Records in 1989, but not in the US until 1990 under Metal Blade Records, as Mean Machine had all but dissolved at this point. It was with the release of Piece of Time that Atheists truly marked themselves the fathers of technical death metal. Their lyrical content on this record would prove to be a much-needed change, and while Schaefer's writing at the time comes off as a bit sophomoric and preachy, his unabashed, anti-religious lyrics were a breath of fresh air amidst a sea of bands that reveled in the atmosphere of mindless death and Satanism. Piece of Time was a beautiful exercise in technical death metal, with new and creative approaches bursting from the minds of its core members. It was around this time that Atheist's lineup would be rocked by tragedy. In 1991, Roger Patterson would pass in a car accident at the untimely age of 23. The band was entirely devastated at the loss of their bass player, but interestingly, Roger had made a comment the night before the accident that in the case that Patterson was no longer with us, he would want them to continue. So they moved forward. but found it impossible to find a bass player with such a jazzy yet aggressive style. They first looked to Doug Keyser of Watchtower, who declined, citing that the music was just not to his style of playing. Their next best choice was Tony Choi. And while he didn't have the kind of attack that Patterson had, his smooth, jazzy style of bass playing was the best that they could find. Now before we go any further, I just want to take a second to talk about Tony Choi. While today we see lots of drummers, guitarists, and bass players flip-flop from band to band with reckless abandon, it's arguable that none have quite the decorated resume of one Tony Choi. In 1991 alone, Tony Choi played bass on Cynic's Roadrunner demo, Pestilence's Testimony of the Ancients, and Atheist's Unquestionable Presence. In 1 year, Tony Choi hit the trifecta for what would later become the three most progressive, experimental, and influential death metal bands in 1993. In fact, during the recording of Unquestionable Presence is when Tony Choi got offered to play on Pestilence's Testimony of the Ancients. He learned the songs in 1 day and recorded them the next. So Atheist's 1991 follow-up would take their initial technical approach and begin to fuse jazz influences, especially to the rhythm section. Unquestionable Presence is, to most who have heard it, Atheist's unequivocal magnum opus. Unquestionable Presence seemingly weaved in and out of death metal and free jazz at a moment's notice. Songs like And the Psychic Saw and Mother Man stand the test of time as some of the hardest musical compositions to play and perfect in the entire genre of death metal. So Tony Choi would be offered by Pestilence to join them on a European tour, leaving Atheist furious and blindsided. Atheist would then recruit Darren McFarland for live bass duties in late 1991. McFarland would later play in Cynic, though this would be short-lived as Cynic did not feel McFarland matched their standard for bass playing. By mid-1992, Rand Berkey and Steve Flynn would depart from the band. Rand would depart due to personal differences with Schaefer, and Steve would attend Florida State University. It was at this point that Atheist began to fizzle out as a band. Kelly Schaefer had even begun his own side project, Neurotica. While working on new songs for Neurotica in Gainesville, Florida, Kelly would receive a call from Metal Blade's Dave Constable. Dave would tell Schaefer that he needed a new Atheist record to be written and recorded by the end of the next month. With such a close deadline and minimal warning from his higher-ups, Schaefer would hunker down and re-enlist Rand Berkey and Tony Choi for lead guitar and bass, respectively. To fill out a second lead guitar was newcomer Frank Emmy, and on drums was Josh Greenbaum. Kelly knew that Flynn's shoes would be hard to fill and elected to soften up the chaos previously heard on Atheist Albums by recording an album with minimal double bass. And when I say minimal, I mean almost no double bass drumming on the entire record. In just around 40 days, the band would finish up writing and recording the entirety of the album at Pro Media Studios in Gainesville with the help of producer Mark Pinsky. Pinsky was a talented producer, having worked with artists like Frank Zappa, Steve Vai, and even Malevolent Creation. Pinsky's greatest weakness, however, was his lack of experience with distorted, loud guitars. In fact, the Pinsky-produced Stillborn by Malevolent Creation is widely considered the worst-sounding album in their discography. Schaefer has stated that while Pinsky was able to make Atheist sound bigger than they ever had before, he seemed unable to adequately manage the sound of so many distorted electric guitars, resulting in a few moments on the album in which the guitars peaked past the clipping point. Regardless, the band was happy to get away from the increasingly similar production that was coming from Scott Burns at Morrisound Studios. Forged in the flames of technical death metal and Latin jazz comes their third and arguably most ambitious full-length LP, Elements. From the gate, there's an expectation of similar motifs from the band's previous output. The album's opener track, Green, is far less chaotic than what we have heard from Atheist on their first two records. Green features a stronger, more present Latin jazz flavor than we've heard in any metal albums before it, despite Atheist's strong penchant for merging jazz into their music. The riffs on Green feel more thrashy than they do death, and Schaefer's voice sounds a lot less aggressive than it ever has. The guitar even feels at times buried in the mix compared to the ever-present bass, almost like a Primus record or something. Despite this, the band do a great job to create a very organic feeling song, with lyrics that feature a pro-environmental spin. The line, "In recent years, the peace upon the greenery has fallen to machinery, tree sap, tears," is poignantly written and remains some of my favorite lyrics to this day. Water is by far my favorite track on this album, for many reasons. The guitar playing on this track is just as compelling as the bass, at times leaving me to decide which I want to pay attention to when I listen to it. The clean, sharp, and jazzy guitar playing in the song's bridges is nothing short of perfect in my eyes. The drumming on Water is probably the most fun to play along with out of any song on the album, but that's probably because Steve Flynn's drumming makes my fucking forearms ache and my fingers bleed. Note the memorable chorus in this song. Once you hear it, I'm sure you'll spend the next several days growling to it in your head. Samba Briza just so happens to be my second favorite track on the album, but it is a shock on first listen. Distorted metal guitars and harsh vocals are nowhere to be found here. In fact, the song is an instrumental. Standing at a short but sweet 2-minute length, you'll either love or hate Samba Briza. It is one of several short instrumental interlude tracks on this record, but it outshines the rest by a mile. As if you couldn't tell by this track's emphasis on drums and bass, it was written by Choi and Greenbaum. Funny enough, a friend of mine once heard me listening to this song and thought I was listening to what he called ringtone music. Nevertheless, whether you love or hate Latin jazz fusion, it's a must listen, either to see how much Atheist grew from the previous effort or how far they fell. Obviously, my position being the former. Air features some riffage reminiscent of Unquestionable Presence, but with restraint. It's certainly a common theme on this album. The utter chaos of previous Atheist records has been harnessed and boiled down to something that at first seems simplistic, but the focused musicianship is certainly still there. Air is also a song that features one of the very few moments of double bass drumming by Josh Greenbaum. While Air is most certainly a decent track, it's definitely not as ear-catching as the previous songs. The only performance that stands out to me on this one is Josh Greenbaum's drumming. Otherwise, this song plays as a fine addition to the running theme of Earth's elements as eternal, sentient beings. Displacement is the second instrumental found on the album, written by Berkey, and features only guitar and bass. Not much is going on with Displacement, and the minimalism is cool on such a busy album, but it could have been left off of the record and I wouldn't have minded in the slightest. Pestilence did something similar on Testimony of the Ancients and Spheres, and they too drifted into filler territory. Animal begins with the shrieking sounds of a guitar pick scraping, like the loud territorial cackling of a hyena. Yep, I'm getting pretentious with it. Anyhow, Animal's thudding rhythm section pounds ominously along in a way that perfectly fits the lyrics' focus on predatory dominance in the animal kingdom. The bass really takes the driver's seat on this track, almost to the detriment of the vocals. With Schaefer's more cleaned-up vocal approach, his vocals are only slightly more comprehensible in comparison to his previous output, and the low volume of his vocals do no favors for his approach. This song convinced me that the album may benefit greatly from a remix, and one that puts a little bit more emphasis on the guitars and a lot more on the vocals. Mineral is one for me that just barely misses the mark. It meanders a bit and there aren't too many memorable moments, save for a post-chorus guitar solo that is a perfect fit. There are a few arrangement twists and turns, but nothing that sticks in my head in this song outside of the lyrics, which are definitely Mineral's greatest strength. Schaefer's writing paints the picture of the mineral as one of Earth's most abused resources. The scorn of the mineral is played perfectly by Schaefer in lines like, "Leave us alone, we never harmed you. Leave us alone, we beg of you. If given a voice, we'd lash out at you. If given a choice, we'd educate you." I think this track really shows how much Schaefer's lyric writing has matured from previous albums. Whereas on previous albums, Schaefer's lyrics sounded like aimless proselytizing, the proverbial man shaking his fist at the sky, the lyrics on Elements sound like a concerted effort to tell a larger, overarching story with a message below the surface. There's a definite pro-environmentalist slant on this album, as heard before on Piece of Time and Unquestionable Presence, but Elements feels much less preachy and more substantive. Fire is where the theme of Elements starts to show its cracks. Imagine sitting yourself down and saying, okay, now I have to write a song about fire. Sounds kind of hard, right? I mean, writing a song about minerals is hard enough, but Schaefer pulled that off with ease. Fire misses the mark lyrically for me, but the instrumentation is compelling enough for me to recommend a listen. The bass feels a lot less present on this one, and instead the guitars really take the lead, which I think is a refresher for such a bass-heavy album. Fractal Point is almost identical to the previous instrumental, Displacement. It's in the same key and played quite similarly, though this time the guitar riff played is no longer ascending in the same manner. The bass line is also much simpler this time around. Essentially, I feel the same about Fractal Point as I do Displacement. It's neat, but it feels a little bit like filler, and I really wouldn't go out of my way to listen to this track unless I was listening to the full album. Earth begins with an almost manic-sounding guitar riff, very reminiscent of something you'd hear on A Piece of Time, but eventually moves into something more in tune with the rest of Elements. The energy on Earth is much higher than what is heard on most of the album. The drums, guitar, and bass are tightly locked in with one another for the entirety of the song, and Schaefer's vocals are a perfect fit for the track. There's even a very short section here where Greenbaum's drumming drops out and is replaced by a very hip-hop sounding beat. I can't imagine how that idea popped into their heads, but it's an exciting, creative decision that I feel greatly adds to the depth of the song itself. The penultimate track, See You Again, is the final of 4 instrumental tracks on the album, and I actually love it. Arrangement-wise, it isn't anything extreme, but the Frank Emmy penned track really lets the guitar breathe. It's a beautiful instrumental, and I often find myself coming back to it, just to hear the sweet noodling. It's super short, but it's powerful in its own minimalist execution. The title track and grand finale to this dive into death metal Latin jazz fusion, Elements, features some of the best riffs on the album. The guitars shift in and out of clean, reverby sounds to chaotic distortion, an awesome display of dynamics. The song's bridge is punctuated by some technical yet tasteful sweet picking, which is an apt reflection on the album as a whole. Technical, yet tasteful. While it's not my favorite on this album, the songwriting on Elements is intricate and impressive. Overall, my verdict on Elements, the album as a whole, is that it is a solid effort from a genius band. And by no means is Elements a perfect album, but its ambition is something to behold. Metal history will remember the name Atheist for its association with versatility, technicality, and bold innovation. When Elements released in 1993, it cemented itself in time as one of the 4 most innovative albums released in all of metal, along with Believer's Dimensions, Cynic's Focus, and Pestilence's Spheres. All albums you must hear if you call yourself a metal fan. Let's call these the Fusion 4, because I'm a nerd who comes up with nerdy names for nerdy things that I like. Elements released to mixed reviews, and according to Kelly Schaefer, the sales numbers are sort of a mystery since Metal Blade kept them in the dark to rip them off. Atheist would go on a European tour to support Elements' release, mostly because they were just eager to be around an audience more receptive to their stylings. In fact, some of their shows on the Euro tour got encores. However, once they got on the road, Kelly Schaefer resigned from rhythm guitar duties to exclusively lead vocals due to his struggles with carpal tunnel. Josh Greenbaum was also replaced by Marcel DeSantos on drums, as Greenbaum was tracking drums for River Phoenix's unreleased album with his band, Alika's Attic. The band played one more show in St. Petersburg, Florida on October 24th, 1993, and were actually on track to play again in Europe until Rand Berkey got into serious trouble with local authorities. So the band had already filled their record contract obligations and thusly went their separate ways, with Kelly Schaefer moving on to focus on his solo project Neurotica, which would get signed to WWF's record label SmackDown Records in 2001. There were talks in 1995 of an Atheist comeback album, but it never came to fruition, in part due to living distances and personal differences. It seemed that this was the unsatisfactory end for the tale of Atheist, until 2006 when the band reformed with Schaefer, Flynn, Berkey, and Choi, and new rhythm guitarist Sonny Carson. The lineup would shift again following the ousting of Berkey in favor of new guitarist Chris Baker. They would release their first record in 17 years, titled Jupiter, with Jonathan Thompson handling nearly all guitar and bass duties. Atheist marches forward even amidst continuous lineup changes. Schaefer remains the leading figure in the band, proving that if the music can stand the test of time, a band can always play on.